She thought the hearing would be routine. One signature, one stamp, one final step before she could finally stop holding her breath. The baby slept against her chest, warm and impossibly light, unaware that his future was about to be negotiated by strangers in dark suits. Then the judge stopped reading. The room shifted. A man she had never seen before stood up. He didn't rush. He didn't look at her first. He looked at the baby. "I'm not here to take him away," he said calmly. "I'm here because the law already gave him to me." Her heart slammed against her ribs. The judge turned the file so she could see the name written in bold ink, one she recognized from the death certificate. The last name of a man who was supposed to be gone forever. "You can keep the child," the stranger continued, his voice low, precise. "But you will never raise him alone." That was when she understood. This wasn't an adoption hearing. It was a custody battle she never agreed to fight. Hart stepped into the family courtroom with Milo cradled against her chest, his tiny weight anchoring her to the present. The polished wooden doors closed softly behind her, sealing off the outside world, the sleepless nights, the unanswered emails from social workers, the quiet panic that came every time she wondered if loving him would be enough. Today was supposed to be the end of all that. One final hearing, one signature, one legal acknowledgement that the child she had fought for, fed, rocked through fevers and nightmares, was finally hers. 3 months. That was all it had taken to unravel the life she used to know and replace it with something fragile and ferocious. 3 months of learning how to breathe quietly so she wouldn't wake him. 3 months of hearings, home visits, and forms that never seemed to end. She had survived it all. She was still standing. And Milo was still here. The judge skimmed the file in front of her, glasses perched low on her nose. Hart sat straighter, fingers unconsciously curling into the fabric of Milo's blanket. She had imagined this moment too many times, walking out of this room lighter, free, finally allowed to call herself what she already was in every way that mattered. Then the judge stopped turning pages. The pause was small, almost polite. But it was enough. "Before we proceed," the judge said, her voice careful, measured, "the court needs to confirm the status of the secondary guardian listed in the child's file." Hart blinked. Secondary guardian. Her attorney shifted beside her, a faint crease appearing between his brows. Hart's stomach tightened. No one had mentioned this. Not once. The social worker hadn't. The agency hadn't. There was no secondary guardian. There couldn't be. The sound of a chair moving broke the silence. A man stood up from the back row. Hart noticed him in fragments, at first the tailored dark suit, the way he moved without hesitation, the quiet authority that seemed to bend the air around him. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his posture straight in a way that suggested control rather than tension. When he turned toward the bench, the light caught his eyes, pale and cold, like steel polished too many times. "I'm here," he said. His voice was low, calm, entirely out of place in a room built on fear and pleading. Hart's heart stuttered. The judge nodded once. "Please state your name for the record." The man didn't look at Hart when he spoke. He looked at Milo, Lucian Moretti. He said, "I am the child's designated contingency guardian." The words landed with surgical precision. Hart's breath left her lungs. She tightened her hold on Milo, instinctively angling her body away from the stranger. Contingency guardian. The phrase echoed, hollow and impossible. "That's not possible," she said, her voice sharper than she intended. "The child's father is deceased." Lucian finally looked at her. The intensity of his gaze made her skin prickle, as if he were assessing something far beyond what she had said, not just her words, but her stance, her grip on the baby, the exhaustion etched into her face. "My brother is deceased," he corrected quietly. "Not the law." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Hart shook her head. "He never acknowledged the baby. He never signed anything. I was there. I would have known." Lucian reached into his briefcase and removed a thin folder. He crossed the room with unhurried steps and placed it on the clerk's desk. The sound it made soft. Final felt far too loud. 6 months before the accident, he said, "My brother filed a sealed addendum to his estate documents. In the event of his death, Guardianship of his biological child would default to me until permanent custody was established. The judge opened the folder. Hart watched her eyes move across the page, watched the moment her expression shifted from neutral to grave. "No," Hart whispered. The judge looked up. "Ms. Hart, this document is valid." Hart stood abruptly, Milo stirring against her chest. "That can't be right." He didn't even know. Her voice faltered. He didn't know about the baby. Lucian's jaw tightened, just for a second. He knew enough to prepare. The judge folded her hands. According to Illinois family law, when a biological parent has named a contingency guardian, that individual retains legal standing during adoption proceedings. Hart felt the room tilt. "What does that mean?" she asked, though dread already curled in her chest. "It means," the judge said carefully, "that the adoption cannot be finalized without Mr. Moretti's consent." Silence crashed down. Hart's ears rang as if something inside her had shattered. She looked down at Milo, at the slow rise and fall of his chest, at the faint crease between his brows that appeared when he dreamed. She had promised him safety. She had promised him permanence. She had promised him she would never let anyone take him. Lucian spoke again, his tone measured, almost gentle. "I'm not here to remove the child from your care." Her gaze snapped up, fury flashing through her fear. "Then why are you here?" "Because the law put me here," he said, "and because my nephew deserves more than uncertainty." The judge cleared her throat. "Mr. Moretti is not contesting custody at this time. However, the court requires that he be included as a legal party moving forward." Hart laughed once, sharp and brittle, included how Lucian met her eyes. As a co-guardian, the words sliced through her. "No," she said immediately. "Absolutely not." The judge's expression softened, but her voice did not. "Ms. Hart, without Mr. Moretti's cooperation, the adoption cannot proceed. The alternative would be temporary placement under state supervision until the matter is resolved." Hart's knees weakened. State supervision meant foster care. It meant strangers. It meant nights Milo would cry without her there to answer. Lucian watched her carefully, something unreadable flickering behind his eyes. "You don't lose him today," he said quietly. "But you also don't get to pretend you're doing this alone." Hart swallowed hard, her throat burning. She had walked into the courtroom believing she was finally crossing the finish line. Instead, she had discovered the race had never been hers to run alone. She didn't lose her son. But in that moment, she lost the right to be the only one who could call herself his mother. If this story touched your heart, follow the channel to enjoy many more heart-stirring stories every week. The hallway outside the courtroom felt colder than it should have been. Hart walked with Milo pressed tightly against her chest, each step controlled, deliberate, as if moving too fast might fracture what little stability she had left. Her attorney murmured something about scheduling and next steps, but the words slid past her without taking shape. All she could hear was the echo of one sentence, repeating like a fault line opening beneath her feet. "The adoption cannot be finalized without his consent." Lucian Moretti followed several paces behind, unhurried. He didn't rush to close the distance. He didn't speak. That restraint unsettled her more than any argument would have. Men who waited were usually the ones who already knew they were going to win. They stopped near a long bench by the windows overlooking the city. Hart turned at last, her eyes sharp, her spine straight despite the tremor running through her arms. "You should have told me," she said. "If you knew about Milo, if you knew this was coming, you should have said something before today." Lucian regarded her calmly. "You wouldn't have listened." Her breath caught. "You don't know me. I know enough," he replied. "You would have fought me. You still are. That's because you walked into my life like you owned it. I walked in because the law opened the door." She looked away, down at Milo's sleeping face, willing her anger to settle. Losing control wouldn't help her. It never had. "What do you want?" she asked quietly. Lucian's gaze softened, just slightly, when it returned to the child. "Stability? That's not an answer." "It is," he said, "just not the one you expected." They relocated to a small conference room reserved for private consultations. The air smelled faintly of old paper and lemon polish. Hart sat at one end of the table, Milo cradled in her arms. Lucian took the opposite seat, leaving the space between them conspicuously empty. He slid a folder across the table. She didn't touch it. Co-guardianship, he said. Temporary, until the adoption is complete. Joint legal authority, documented schedules, court oversight. No, Hart said immediately. I won't share him with a stranger. Lucian didn't flinch. You already are. Her fingers tightened around the blanket. You don't get to decide that. I don't. He agreed. The court does. Silence stretched between them, taut and heavy. Milo shifted, making a soft sound, and Hart instinctively rocked him. The movement drew Lucian's attention. For the first time, something flickered in his expression, something unguarded, quickly masked. You can walk away, Hart said suddenly. You don't have to do this. Lucian's mouth curved in a humorless smile. My brother didn't walk away. Neither will I. The words carried weight she didn't yet understand. What if I refuse, she asked. Lucian met her gaze. Then the court pauses the adoption. Social services steps in. Temporary placement becomes a real possibility. Her chest tightened painfully. You'd risk that I'd prevent it, he corrected, by staying involved. The logic was infuriatingly sound. Hart closed her eyes for a brief moment, gathering herself. When she opened them again, her voice was steady. If I agree to this, there will be conditions. Lucian inclined his head slightly. Go on. No relocation without my consent. No staff handling Milo unless I approve them. No decisions made behind my back. Lucian listened without interruption. And, she added, lifting her chin, this is not a takeover. You don't override me. You don't buy your way past me. We decide together. For a moment, Lucian said nothing. He studied her with an intensity that made her skin prickle, as if she were a problem he hadn't expected to respect. Agreed, he said at last, with one addition. Her pulse quickened. Which is, you stop pretending you can do this alone. Heat rushed to her face. That's not your decision to make. It is if your exhaustion puts him at risk. The accusation stung because it wasn't entirely untrue. A knock interrupted them. The clerk announced that preliminary documents would be prepared for review. Lucian stood, straightening his jacket. My attorney will send you the agreement tonight. I have my own lawyer, Hart said. Though the words felt thin even to her, Lucian's eyes flicked briefly to her worn bag, the faint dark circles under her eyes. He said nothing. They parted shortly after, the unspoken tension trailing between them. Hart walked out of the building with Milo bundled against her, the city noise rushing back in like a tide. She felt watched even when she didn't turn around. That night, after Milo was asleep, the agreement arrived. 43 pages. Dense, precise, unforgiving. Joint legal authority, shared medical decisions, mandatory documentation, scheduled reviews. Lucian's signature was already there. Her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. Read it carefully. We meet tomorrow at 9. No greeting, no explanation. Hart stared at the screen, anger and fear twisting together. She should have thrown the phone aside. She should have refused. Instead, she picked up a pen. When she signed her name, it felt like crossing an invisible line. She didn't know yet whether she had just secured Milo's future or handed part of it to the most dangerous man she had ever met. Hart arrived at the address just before 9, Milo's carrier heavy against her arm. Her nerves wound tight beneath her composure. The townhouse stood on a quiet, immaculate street where the sidewalks looked newly washed and the doors closed with deliberate discretion. Brass fixtures gleamed, cameras were present but unobtrusive. Nothing here felt accidental. The door opened before she knocked. Elena introduced herself with professional warmth and efficient eyes, taking in Hart's posture, Milo's blanket, the tension held too carefully in her shoulders. Hart declined the offer to take the baby without hesitation, the word no leaving her mouth sharper than intended. Elena only nodded, as if approval had been earned, and led her inside. The interior was all pale stone and dark wood, a study in restraint. The air carried the faint scent of cedar and something expensive she couldn't name. Hart felt it immediately, the difference between a home and a fortress. This place was designed to keep things safe by keeping them controlled. Lucian waited at the far end of the hall, jacket buttoned, expression neutral. He acknowledged her presence with a glance that lingered on Milo for half a second longer than necessary. "You're early," he said. "You said 9. Most people treat that as a suggestion. I'm not most people." "No," he agreed quietly. He led them upstairs without asking if she was ready. The nursery occupied the sunniest room in the house. Soft gray-blue walls, white furniture, a crib untouched, a changing table stocked with supplies in precise order, a rocking chair positioned to catch the light. Everything perfect, everything unused. Hart stopped short. "When did you do this?" she asked. 2 months ago." The number hit her harder than she expected. "You've known about Milo for 2 months." "I've known since the accident," Lucian said. "I waited." "For what?" "For you to decide." Her breath left her in a sharp exhale. "You were watching me. I was making sure he was safe. By spying, by staying out of your way," he countered. "You kept him. You fought for him. That mattered." Hart stared at the crib, at the space Lucian had prepared for a child he hadn't held yet. "You could have stepped in sooner." "Yes," he said, "and you would have resisted. You still are." She turned then, anger flaring. "You don't get credit for restraint. I'm not asking for it." They moved back downstairs as the doorbell rang. Patricia arrived with her tablet and practiced neutrality, inspecting the house with the thoroughness of someone who trusted documentation more than intention. Lucian answered every question with calm precision. Pediatrician on call, parenting courses completed, travel adjusted, contingencies planned. Hart watched him perform competence like a language he'd been born speaking. When Patricia turned to her, stylus hovering, Hart answered honestly but briefly. She was tired. She was managing. She had support limited, but sufficient. "She's exhausted," Lucian said without looking at her. "She's been doing this alone." Hart bristled. "I didn't ask you to speak for me." Lucian's eyes flicked to hers. "A warning there. Not now." Patricia made a note, satisfied enough to move on, and left them alone again with the quiet hum of a house that had never learned to be lived in. "You undermined me," Hart said once the door closed. "You were minimizing," Lucian replied. "That doesn't help anyone. You don't get to decide how I present my life. I get to decide when your pride endangers my nephew." The word nephew lodged somewhere in her chest, unexpected and heavy. They sat at the dining table afterward, papers spread between them, building a schedule that felt more like a ceasefire than a plan. Lucian typed while Hart dictated her non-negotiables. Late evenings were hers, Saturdays were hers. He took Sundays without argument. "Overnights," he said finally. Hart froze. "He's 3 months old. And he needs consistency," Lucian said evenly, "which we provide together. He doesn't know you. He will." The certainty in his voice unsettled her. "Not yet," she said. "Give him time." Lucian studied her for a long moment, then nodded. 2 weeks. When Elena returned with a folder as Hart prepared to leave, Hart almost refused it on instinct. Inside was a check and a note in Lucian's precise handwriting. Rent, legal expenses. "Non-negotiable. I can't accept this," Hart said, her hands shaking despite herself. Elena's expression softened. "You can't afford not to." Hart made it to her car before the tears came, not from humiliation or gratitude, but from the terrifying relief of being seen when she'd been drowning for so long. That night, after Milo slept, Hart lay awake replaying Lucian's words, his restraint, the way his gaze softened when he thought no one was watching. She didn't trust him. She couldn't. But somewhere beneath the fear and anger, a quieter realization took shape. Lucian Moretti wasn't trying to take Milo from her. He was trying to build something strong enough that the child would never be taken from either of them. And that, somehow, made him far more dangerous. The first thing Hart lost was sleep. The second was patience. The third was the illusion that she could keep the worlds she was juggling from colliding. By the second week of shared guardianship, her days began before sunrise and ended long after Milo finally surrendered to sleep. Mornings were for feeding schedules and rushed emails. Afternoons disappeared into meetings at St. Briar Academy. Evenings where parents expected immediate answers and administrators expected impossible availability. Evenings belonged to court-mandated documentation, checklists, and messages she resented needing to send. Lucian's name began appearing everywhere on forms, on schedules, in her phone notifications. He was meticulous, precise, always 2 steps ahead. He never missed a deadline, never forgot a detail, and never asked how she was holding up. At work, the tension sharpened. Doctor? Piton's assistant stopped smiling when Hart requested yet another adjustment to her schedule. A parent demanded an emergency meeting over an incident Hart had already resolved. Another accused her of favoritism. Whispers followed her through hallways she had once navigated with quiet authority. The warning came on a Wednesday afternoon. Dr. Piton closed his office door with deliberate care. "You've missed 2 board meetings this month," he said, fingers steepled. "And there's been an increase in complaints." Hart kept her posture steady. "I'm managing a family court situation. I understand personal difficulties," he replied. "But this role requires consistency. We need to know you're fully present." She left the office with her jaw clenched, the threat unspoken but clear. One more misstep and everything she depended on would fracture. That evening, her phone buzzed as she rocked Milo in the dim light of her apartment. "Lucian, your employment letter is due Friday." She stared at the message, anger flaring. He had no idea what that request would cost her. Or maybe he did. "I'll handle it," she typed back. "I can assist," came the immediate reply. "I didn't ask you to." Several seconds passed before his response appeared. "That doesn't change the necessity." The next day, the parent complaint exploded. A voicemail from an unfamiliar number accused Hart of mishandling a serious altercation between students. By noon, the issue had escalated beyond her authority. By 3, Dr. Piton summoned her again, this time with a legal advisor present. Hart felt the walls closing in. Lucian found out before she told him. He appeared at the school unannounced, his presence rippling through the front office like a disturbance in still water. Parents stared. Staff whispered. Hart saw him through the glass and felt a flash of panic so sharp it almost stole her breath. "What are you doing here?" she demanded as soon as they were alone. "You're in trouble," he said calmly. "You don't get to walk into my workplace. I get to prevent a collapse that would affect my nephew." Her hands curled into fists. "This is my life, and it's unraveling." She turned away, fighting the sting in her eyes. Leave. Lucian didn't. He spoke to the administration. He made calls. He applied pressure so subtly it was almost invisible. By the end of the day, the complaint was downgraded, but the damage lingered. Hart's position no longer felt secure. It felt conditional. That night, she confronted him. "You made it worse," she said, voice tight. "They see me as a liability now." Lucian's expression hardened. "I stopped it from becoming a formal investigation." "You made them look at me differently." "They were already looking," he replied. "You just didn't want to see it." The truth cut deeper than the argument. Silence followed, heavy and charged. Milo stirred between them, his small sounds grounding and relentless. "You can't fix everything with influence," Hart said finally. Lucian exhaled slowly. "You can't fix everything by refusing help." They stood too close, the air between them taut with unspoken things. Hart became acutely aware of his height, his heat, the way his gaze lingered as if cataloging every crack she worked so hard to hide. "I don't need you to save me," she said. Lucian's voice dropped. "You need me not to let you drown." She looked away before he could see how close she was to breaking. Later that night, when Milo finally slept, Hart sat at her kitchen table staring at unpaid bills and half-written emails. Her phone buzzed again. "Lucian, I transferred funds to cover your rent and legal fees." Her breath caught. "I didn't consent to that. You didn't need to." Her hands trembled as she typed. "I won't be controlled." The reply came slower this time. "Then stop forcing yourself to survive on the edge." Hart closed her eyes, the words echoing too close to her fears. Across the city, Lucian stood in his darkened office, staring out at a skyline he had long mastered. Control had always been his language, power, his shield. But Hart didn't bend the way others did. She cracked in quiet places, dangerous places, where influence couldn't reach. For the first time in years, Lucian wasn't certain his methods were enough. And Hart, lying awake beside Milo, began to understand something equally unsettling. The man she was fighting wasn't trying to take her child. He was trying to keep her from losing everything else. The first sign that something was wrong came in the form of silence. Lucian stopped messaging first. The meticulous updates, the clipped reminders, the quiet presence that had threaded itself through Hart's days, all of it receded, leaving a hollow space that unsettled her more than his interference ever had. Milo spent his afternoons at her apartment again, the 2-week adjustment period nearing its end, and Hart told herself the calm was a relief. It wasn't. On a rain-soaked evening, her phone rang with an unfamiliar number. She almost ignored it, too exhausted to entertain another complication, but something in her chest tightened before she answered. "Ms. Hart?" A male voice said, "This is Detective Rowan, Chicago PD. I'd like to ask you a few questions about Leander Moretti." Her breath caught. "He died 3 months ago." "Yes," the detective replied. "And recent information suggests his death may not have been accidental." The words landed slowly, sinking beneath her skin before she could brace for them. They met the next morning at a small cafe near the station. The detective spoke carefully, choosing his words with the restraint of someone used to watching reactions. Leander's accident had been closed quickly, too quickly. There were discrepancies in the timeline. A witness statement that hadn't matched the report, a vehicle spotted near the scene that didn't belong there. And the baby Hart asked, her voice barely steady. Rowan met her gaze. If Leander believed he was in danger, the child may have been a factor. Hart left the cafe shaking. She didn't go home. She didn't go to work. She went to Lucian. The townhouse loomed darker than usual under the gray sky. Elena let her in without question, concern flickering across her otherwise controlled expression. Hart climbed the stairs with Milo held tightly, her heart pounding with every step. Lucian stood in his office, jacket off, sleeves rolled up. He looked up as she entered, surprise flashing briefly across his face. "You knew," Hart said before he could speak. Lucian closed his laptop slowly. "What did you hear?" "That your brother didn't die by chance," she said. "That he was scared. That he thought someone might come after his child." Silence thickened the room. Lucian's jaw tightened. He moved toward the window, staring out at the city as if gathering himself. "Leander made enemies," he said finally. "He always believed he could manage them. And I believed he was wrong." Hart stepped closer. "You never told me Milo could be in danger. I never knew how much," Lucian replied. "Only that there was risk." "That's not your decision to make alone," she snapped. "You let me believe this was about control and legality." "It still is," he said quietly. "Just not only that." He turned then, and she saw something she hadn't before fear. Stark and unfiltered. "Leander came to me 6 months before he died." Lucian continued. "He said he'd made a mistake, that he'd gotten someone pregnant and hadn't told her the truth about our family. He asked me to prepare for the worst." Hart's throat burned. "He didn't tell me. I told him to." Lucian said, "He wanted to protect you, and instead he left us exposed." She whispered. Lucian's voice dropped. "I attended the funeral. I paid the hospital bills. I watched from a distance because stepping in too soon would have drawn attention." "You were testing me," Hart said. "I was measuring the risk," he corrected, "and you proved you'd protect him at any cost." The words should have reassured her. Instead, they frightened her. "So what now?" she asked. "More guards? More rules? More control?" Lucian shook his head slowly. "Now we acknowledge the truth." They stood inches apart, the tension between them shifting, deepening. Hart became acutely aware of his presence, the warmth he radiated, the restraint he wielded like armor. "You don't trust me," he said. "I trust you with Milo," she replied. "I don't trust the world you come from." "That world doesn't get to decide his future," Lucian said. "Not anymore." The doorbell rang, sharp and insistent. Elena appeared moments later, her composure strained. "Mr. Moretti? There's been a security breach at the garage. Nothing serious?" But Hart's blood ran cold. Lucian was already moving, issuing quiet instructions into his phone, his focus absolute. Within minutes, the house shifted into controlled motion. Systems locked. Staff mobilized. Milo whimpered, startled by the change in atmosphere. Hart held him close, heart racing. Lucian returned, his expression tight. It was a test. A test. Hart echoed. Someone wanted to see how quickly I'd respond, he said, and how visible the child is. The implications settled heavily between them. You can't keep him here, Hart said. Not like this. Lucian met her gaze. I can protect him. At what cost, Lucian didn't answer. That night, Hart lay awake in Lucian's guest room, Milo sleeping beside her, the rain tapping against the windows like a warning. She thought of Leander's fear, of Lucian's silence, of the life Milo had been born into without consent. Across the hall, Lucian stood alone in the nursery, one hand resting on the untouched crib. For the first time since his brother's death, the weight of his choices pressed down on him without relief. He had stepped into this to control the outcome. He was beginning to realize control might not be enough to save any of them. The first overnight happened without ceremony. Hart told herself it was just another step in a process she hadn't chosen, but was navigating anyway. Milo's bag sat by the door, packed with methodical care extra onesies, his favorite blanket, the bottle he preferred when he was overtired. Lucian watched from a careful distance, hands clasped behind his back, giving her space that felt deliberate rather than kind. You can call any time, he said. I know, Hart replied, though her voice wavered despite her efforts. She left before she could change her mind. The silence in her apartment was unbearable. She checked her phone too often, listening for sounds that weren't there, replaying Lucian's words from the night before. I can protect him. The promise had sounded steady, absolute. And yet, the city outside her window felt too loud, too unpredictable, for any promise to hold. Her phone rang just after midnight. Lucian's name lit up the screen. Her heart leapt into her throat. What happened? He's fine, Lucian said quickly. He woke up crying. I couldn't settle him. Hart was already pulling on her jacket. I'm coming. No, he said, sharper than before. I've got it. She hesitated. Lucian, I said I've got it. The line went dead. Hart stood there, phone clenched in her hand, anger and fear colliding in her chest. He had never cut her off before. The restraint he wore so carefully had cracked, and the sound of it had echoed long after the call ended. Across the city, Lucian paced the nursery. Milo cradled awkwardly against his shoulder. The baby's cries cut through the quiet, sharp and relentless, each one tightening something in Lucian's chest he hadn't realized was there. He had memorized schedules, read guides, watched Hart's movements closely. None of it mattered when Milo cried like this, raw, inconsolable, reaching for something Lucian couldn't give. I'm here, Lucian murmured, though the words felt useless. His hands shook as he adjusted his grip, sweat breaking at his temples. He had negotiated billion-dollar contracts without blinking. He had dismantled threats with a phone call. None of that prepared him for the way this small life unraveled him. He pressed his forehead briefly to Milo's, eyes closing. Please. The crying eased. Just a little. Lucian sank into the rocking chair, heart pounding, rocking slowly as exhaustion crept up on him without warning. Fear followed close behind, sharp and merciless. Not fear of failure, fear of loss. The kind that hollowed him out from the inside. By morning, the house felt altered. Hart arrived at sunrise, eyes shadowed, jaw set. She took Milo from Lucian's arms without a word, instinctively checking him over, counting breaths, noting the faint redness around his eyes. You should have called me, she said finally. Lucian stood very still. I needed to know I could do it. And she asked. His gaze met hers, stripped of its usual distance. I almost couldn't. The admission hung between them, fragile and dangerous. Before Hart could respond, Patricia arrived, her presence shifting the air immediately. She took in the tension, the exhaustion etched into both their faces, the unspoken strain. Let's sit, she said gently. The questions came methodically. How had the overnight gone? Any concerns? Any incidents? Lucian answered calmly, choosing his words with care. Hart listened, her unease growing as the conversation progressed. Something was being said beneath the surface, something she couldn't quite name. Patricia paused, stylus hovering. Given the recent security concerns, she said, the court has recommended a temporary review. Hart's stomach dropped. Review of what placement? Patricia replied. Just until the investigation concludes. No, Hart said, standing abruptly. That's not necessary. It's precautionary, Patricia said softly. No one is questioning your care. Lucian rose as well. This is unnecessary. I can increase security. Patricia's gaze shifted between them. That's precisely the concern. The words landed like a blow. 2 hours later, the decision came down. Temporary placement. Short term. Supervised. Hart felt the room blur as Milo was gently taken from her arms. She followed the motion instinctively, a sound tearing from her throat before she could stop it. Lucian's hand caught her elbow, steadying her, but she barely felt it. This is my fault, he said hoarsely. She turned on him, eyes blazing. You said you could protect him. I still can. Then why is he being taken from us? Lucian had no answer. The drive home was silent. Hart stared out the window, her reflection fractured by passing lights. The apartment felt empty in a way that stole her breath. She sank onto the couch, arms wrapped around herself, shaking. Lucian stood in the doorway, helpless for the first time in his adult life. Control had always been his refuge, his weapon. Tonight, it had failed him. I won't let this stand, he said quietly. Hart laughed once, broken and hollow. You don't get to decide that anymore. She turned away from him, grief closing in like a wall. Lucian left shortly after, the sound of the door closing too final, too loud. Later, alone in his darkened office, Lucian stared at the city he had once believed he owned. For the first time, he understood the full cost of what he had set in motion. He hadn't just underestimated the threat outside his world. He had underestimated what it meant to care about something he couldn't control. And somewhere across the city, Hart lay awake in an empty apartment, realizing the most terrifying truth of all. Loving Milo had never been the risk. Trusting Lucian had been. The apartment no longer sounded like a home. Without Milo's breathing, without the soft rustle of blankets, or the quiet urgency that had defined every hour of Hart's life, the silence felt aggressive, almost accusatory. It pressed against her chest until breathing became an effort she had to remember. 2 days. That was how long Milo had been gone. 2 days since the social worker's careful hands had lifted him from her arms. 2 days since Hart had woken up reaching for a crib that wasn't there. She hadn't cried again, not really. Something inside her had gone too still for that. Lucian called once. She didn't answer. He showed up the next morning. Hart opened the door already exhausted, dark circles carved beneath her eyes, her hair pulled back with the same precision she used when she needed to feel in control. The moment she saw him, something raw twisted in her chest. Not relief, not anger, but the terrible awareness that he was the only other person who understood what had been taken from her. You shouldn't be here, she said. Lucian stepped inside anyway, closing the door behind him. He looked different, less composed. His suit jacket was missing, his shirt wrinkled, the faint shadow of sleeplessness etched along his jaw. I've been working on it, he said. The review, the placement, I can have him back with us within a week. Hart laughed softly. It startled them both. With us, Lucian stiffened. That's what this has always been. No, she said, her voice quiet but unyielding. That's what you wanted it to be. He took a step closer. Hart, you said you could protect him, she interrupted. You said your world could keep him safe, and now he's in a room full of strangers because of that same world. Lucian didn't deny it. The silence between them thickened. I can move him, he said finally. Out of the city, out of reach, somewhere secure, somewhere no one can touch him. Her heart slammed painfully against her ribs. You mean disappear? I mean protect. At the cost of everything else, she said. His stability, his future, his right to grow up without being afraid of who he is. Lucian's jaw tightened. Fear keeps people alive, and it also destroys them, Hart replied. I won't raise my son like that. The word son hung between them, heavy and irrevocable. Lucian looked away first. "You don't understand what's at stake," he said. "I understand exactly what's at stake," she shot back. "You're asking me to choose between safety and freedom, and I won't do that to him. You'd rather risk losing him again." His voice sharpened. "The court won't ignore real threats. I'd rather risk losing him than teach him that running is the only way to survive." She said, "I'd rather fight in the open than hide in a fortress." Lucian turned back to her, eyes dark with something dangerously close to desperation. "You don't know how this world works." "I don't care," Hart said. "I care about Milo knowing where he belongs." For a long moment, they stood facing each other, the space between them charged with everything they refused to name. Lucian had faced enemies without flinching. He had buried his brother without breaking. But this choice split him in ways he hadn't anticipated. "You're asking me to stand still," he said quietly. "To expose him." "I'm asking you to trust me," Hart replied. "To trust that we don't have to become what we're afraid of." Lucian let out a slow breath, the sound heavy with restraint. "If I do this your way, I lose leverage, influence, protection. And if you do it your way," she said softly, "you lose us." The truth of it settled like a final blow. That night, Lucian made the call he had avoided since Leander's death. The one to the people who had always expected him to choose power over principle. He listened in silence as threats were implied, as warnings sharpened. Then he did something none of them expected. He said no. The fallout was immediate. Contracts paused, support wavered. Whispers began circulating through the circles that had once obeyed him without question. By morning, Lucian's name was attached to uncertainty, a vulnerability he had never allowed before. Hart learned what he'd done from Patricia, not from him. He refused to relocate the child, Patricia said carefully, and declined several protective measures. Hart's pulse raced. "What does that mean?" "It means," Patricia said, "that he's prioritizing reunification over control." Hart didn't know whether to be afraid or relieved. Lucian didn't come back that night. When he finally did, 2 days later, he looked like a man who had shed something he could never reclaim. He stood in the doorway, exhaustion etched deep into his features. "I chose your way," he said. Hart's breath caught. Why Lucian met her gaze. The steel in his eyes softened by something far more dangerous. "Because if I lose him," he said, "I want it to be because I stood with you, not because I ran." She didn't move toward him. She didn't reach out. But for the first time since Milo had been taken, hope stirred fragile, trembling, and terrifying. They had chosen the harder path, and neither of them knew yet whether love would be enough to survive it. The hearing was shorter than Hart expected. That was what frightened her the most. She sat rigid in the narrow courtroom chair, hands clasped tightly in her lap, listening as words like temporary, precautionary, and best interest passed between lawyers who never once said Milo's name with the tenderness she did. Lucian stood beside her, silent, composed, but she could feel the tension radiating from him like heat. This time, he wasn't directing the room. He was waiting. The judge's decision came down without drama. Temporary placement would remain in effect until the investigation concluded. Visitation would be supervised, limited, structured. Hart didn't react at first. She nodded when expected to, signed where indicated, followed the procedure with mechanical obedience. It wasn't until she stepped outside into the cold afternoon air that the truth of it pressed in. They were walking away without Milo. Lucian placed a hand at the small of her back, steadying her as she swayed. The contact was instinctive, protective, but it made something inside her snap. "Don't," she said quietly, stepping away. Lucian froze. "Hart, I can't," she whispered. "I can't lean on you right now." He let his hand fall. The days that followed blurred into something colorless. Hart returned to work out of necessity rather than purpose, moving through hallways that felt increasingly unfamiliar. Whispers followed her again, louder this time. Parents glanced at her with curiosity sharpened by judgment. Dr. Peyton asked her into his office on Friday morning and didn't offer her a seat. "We're placing you on administrative leave," he said, "until the situation stabilizes." Hart nodded once, her throat tight. She had expected it. Somehow, that made it worse. By the time she got home, the apartment felt too small, too quiet. She sat on the floor where Milo's crib had been, fingers pressing into the carpet, and let herself feel the weight of what she had lost. Not just her child, but the version of herself who had believed love and effort were enough. Across the city, Lucian faced his own unraveling. The consequences of his refusal to relocate Milo arrived swiftly and without mercy. Meetings were canceled, calls went unanswered. A board member requested an emergency session under the guise of concern. Lucian attended anyway, his expression unreadable as questions circled him like vultures. "You're exposed," one of them said bluntly, "and you've made us vulnerable by association." Lucian listened, hands folded neatly on the table, then disassociate. Silence followed. By the end of the day, his authority had been fractured. Not dismantled, but questioned. It was the first crack in an empire built on certainty. He didn't tell Hart. They spoke only through necessary channels, now updates from lawyers, brief exchanges during supervised visits. Hart held Milo for exactly 1 hour twice a week, every second measured and observed. She learned to memorize the feel of him again in short bursts, to store his warmth like something precious she might need to survive the cold. Lucian watched from a distance, his jaw tight, his gaze tracking every movement. He never interrupted, never interfered. When Milo reached for Hart, his small fingers curling into her sweater, Lucian looked away. One afternoon, after a visit that ended with Milo crying as he was carried from the room, Hart finally broke. "This isn't working," she said to Lucian in the empty hallway afterward. Her voice was steady, but her eyes burned. "We're losing him." Lucian closed his eyes briefly. "I know. You said choosing my way would give us a chance. It still might. Might isn't enough," she said. "I can't keep doing this. I can't keep pretending this is temporary when it's becoming permanent." Lucian opened his eyes, something resolute settling over his features. "Then we stopped pretending." That night, he made a decision that would cost him more than he had ever lost before. He instructed his attorneys to prepare a public filing, one that severed key ties, relinquished strategic holdings, and removed his name from the structures that had made him untouchable. It was a declaration of vulnerability in a world that punished weakness. When Hart received the notice, she stared at it in disbelief. He didn't have to do this. She murmured. Patricia, standing across from her, gave a small nod. No, he chose to. The next hearing was scheduled quickly after that. As Hart walked into the courtroom days later, something had shifted. Lucian stood beside her, not as a man wielding power, but as one who had laid it down. She felt it in the way the room regarded him, not with deference, but with caution. For the first time, Hart wasn't alone in her fear. For the first time, Lucian wasn't shielded by anything but the truth, and somewhere in the system that had taken Milo from them, the balance began slowly, painfully to tip. The courtroom felt different this time. Hart noticed it the moment she stepped inside. The air was heavier, not with hostility, but with expectation. The murmurs were quieter, the glances more deliberate. This was no longer a procedural review buried in legal language. This was a reckoning. Lucian stood beside her, close enough that she could feel the steady rhythm of his breathing. He looked unlike the man who had first appeared months ago in a tailored suit and absolute certainty. The certainty was still there, but it had been reshaped, tempered by loss, by sacrifice, by something dangerously close to humility. Hart folded her hands together, anchoring herself. Milo wasn't in her arms today. That absence was a deliberate choice. This hearing wasn't about proving she could hold him. It was about proving she could fight for him without breaking. The judge entered, expression neutral, eyes sharp. The proceedings began without preamble. The state's representative spoke first, outlining concerns that had once sounded insurmountable: security risks, family influence, instability. Hart listened without interrupting, her gaze fixed forward, her jaw set. She had heard these arguments before. They no longer frightened her the way they once had. Lucian's attorney followed, methodical and precise, but notably restrained. There was no display of power, no attempt to dominate the room, only facts, only truth. Then Lucian stood. "I would like to address the court directly," he said. Hart turned slightly, surprise flickering through her. He hadn't mentioned this. The judge nodded. "You may." Lucian stepped forward, hands unclenched at his sides. "For most of my life," he began, "I believed control was synonymous with protection. That if I could anticipate every risk, remove every variable, I could keep the people I cared about safe." A pause. That belief failed my brother. The room went still. Lucian continued, his voice steady but stripped of its usual armor. He spoke of Leander's fear, of the threats that had been dismissed as paranoia, of the contingency plans made too late. He spoke of power used as insulation rather than responsibility. "And when I discovered my nephew existed," he said, "I did what I had always done. I tried to manage the outcome." Hart felt something tighten in her chest. "I monitored from a distance. I calculated risk. I waited. What I didn't do," Lucian said quietly, "was trust." He turned then, just enough to glance at Hart. The look they shared was brief, charged, and deeply intimate in a room full of strangers. Ms. Hart protected Milo without resources, without influence, without guarantees, Lucian said. She chose him every day, even when it cost her sleep, her career, her stability. And when I finally stepped forward, I didn't make her life safer. I made it harder. The judge's gaze sharpened. Lucian took a breath. "I am formally relinquishing all claims tied to my family's estate that could pose a future risk to this child. I have withdrawn from positions that create conflict of interest. I am not asking the court to trust my power. I am asking it to recognize my willingness to give it up." A murmur rippled through the room. Hart stared at him, stunned. She had known he'd sacrificed. She hadn't known how completely. The state representative objected, citing precedent, cautioning against emotional appeals. The judge listened, impassive. Then Hart was called to the stand. She rose, legs steady despite the tremor inside her. When she spoke, she didn't plead. She didn't promise perfection. "I never planned to be a mother like this," she said softly. "I didn't have savings or backup plans or a safety net. What I had was love, and the willingness to learn." She described the nights spent pacing the apartment, the fear of doing something wrong, the moments she doubted herself most. She spoke of Milo's first smile, his quiet trust, the way he calmed when she held him close. "I don't believe safety comes from hiding," Hart said. "I believe it comes from belonging. Milo doesn't need a fortress. He needs people who will stand in front of him when the world gets loud." She looked at Lucian again, her voice steady. He learned that too. The judge asked a final question. "If custody is restored, can you work together?" Hart didn't hesitate. "Yes," Lucian answered at the same time. "Yes." The judge considered them for a long moment, eyes scanned between the two people who had arrived at this point from opposite directions and somehow met in the middle. The decision was deferred, not denied, not granted, deferred until final review. As they exited the courtroom, Hart felt the tension she had been holding for weeks loosen just enough to let her breathe. Lucian walked beside her, silent, his expression unreadable. Outside, winter light spilled across the courthouse steps. "We did everything we could," Hart said quietly. Lucian nodded. "We did it honestly. For the first time since Milo had been taken from them." Hart allowed herself to imagine something beyond survival. Not certainty, not victory, but hope. And hope, she realized, was far more terrifying than fear, because this time, if it broke, it would break both of them. The call came on an ordinary morning. That was how Hart knew it would change everything. She was standing in the kitchen, one hand wrapped around a mug she had reheated twice and still forgotten to drink, when her phone rang. An unfamiliar number. Her heart stuttered, then steadied, as if some deeper instinct had already accepted the outcome waiting on the other end. She answered without speaking. "Ms. Hart?" the judge's clerk said, her tone neutral but not unkind. "The court has reached its decision." Hart closed her eyes. Lucian stood a few steps away, watching her with an intensity that made the air feel charged. He didn't interrupt. He didn't move. He had learned, finally, when restraint mattered. The court has approved permanent joint guardianship, the clerk continued. Effective immediately. Full reunification. No further review required. For a moment, Hart didn't breathe. Permanent reunification. No further review. The words landed slowly, gently, like something precious being set into her hands. Thank you, she managed, her voice unsteady. When the call ended, she looked up at Lucian. It's done, she said. Something in his expression broke not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that rearranged him from the inside out. He let out a breath that sounded like it had been trapped for months. They didn't touch right away. They drove together in silence, the city passing by in soft blurs, each lost in thoughts neither could yet give voice to. When they reached the visitation center, Hart barely registered the formalities. Her body moved on instinct, heart leading where words could not. Milo was waiting. He was smaller than she remembered, or maybe the space between them had made him seem that way. When the social worker placed him in her arms, the world narrowed to the warmth of his body, the familiar weight she had memorized in absence. Milo blinked up at her, confused for only a second before recognition sparked. His small hand curled into her sweater, a sound escaping him that was somewhere between a breath and a laugh. Hart pressed her face into his hair and finally let herself cry. Lucian watched from a step back, his chest tight, his hands clenched at his sides. When Milo reached for him next, the gesture was hesitant but real. Lucian took him carefully, reverently, as if holding something sacred. Hey, he murmured, his voice rough. I've got you. And for the first time, it didn't sound like a promise he was afraid to fail. Life didn't settle into perfection after that. It settled into something better. Hart didn't return to Saint Briar. She found work elsewhere less prestigious, less demanding, but kinder. The apartment stayed small, but it filled with sound again, bottles warming, toys clattering, late-night laughter that replaced fear. Lucian's townhouse changed too. The nursery was no longer untouched. It became lived in, imperfect, alive. They learned each other slowly, not as adversaries, not as saviors, as partners. They argued sometimes about schedules, about boundaries, about whose turn it was to get up at 3 a.m. But the arguments no longer carried the edge of control. They ended in compromise, in quiet understanding, in the shared knowledge that neither of them was alone anymore. One evening, months later, Hart found Lucian standing in the doorway of Milo's room, watching him sleep. The light was low, the city hushed beyond the windows. You okay? She asked softly. Lucian nodded. I keep waiting for something to go wrong. She stepped beside him. Me too. He looked at her then, really looked at her, not as a problem to solve or a risk to manage, but as the woman who had stood her ground when everything told her to yield. I don't know how to do this halfway, he said quietly. I never have. I'm not asking you to, Hart replied. Just don't do it alone. Lucian reached for her hand. This time, she didn't hesitate. They didn't make promises that night. No declarations. No grand vows. Just the quiet certainty of choosing the same direction. Weeks later, as they walked through the park with Milo between them, Hart watched Lucian laugh at something Milo did, an unguarded, genuine sound she had never heard before. It struck her then, sharp and sudden. This wasn't the family she had imagined. It was better, because it wasn't built on control or fear or obligation. It was built on choice, and every day after that, they chose each other again.